free. We've got a bunch of people that have already came in, and I think now's a good time just to respect y'all's time. We'll get started. I'm Bartiz Cox. I direct the marketing and communications team. I'm here at Groundswell, and we are really excited to be launching the series of energy futures conversations throughout this month and next. This first one is going to be featuring Ari Wallach. The title of it is How to Think Like a Futurist in Uncertain Times. I mean, as you know, and you look around, I'm sure many, if not all of us, are working from our homes, trying to, shelter in place and, do some social distancing. And we thought, with all this going on, what a better time to think of the future. So I'm going to pass the microphone to our CEO, Michelle Moore, and she's going to walk us through what we're going to be talking about and kick us off. So thank you all again for joining. And one more thing, you have a hand-raising function if you have signed on via computer. There's going to be a portion later in this conversation where we're going to ask a question and ask you to enter your answer in the chat, and I'm going to choose one of the people who raised their hand to ask Ari that question, and we'll be able to unmute you. You'll be muted until that point. That's that, and Michelle, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bartiz, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today during Passover on Monday, Thursday, to share the lunch hour, or if you're on the West Coast, the coffee hour with us. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce Ari Wallach, who's the founder and executive director of Longpath, and also one of my dearest friends. Back in the day, and I'm dating myself here now too, in the 1990s, Ari was one of the co-founders of Seed Media, which was like the cooler Wired magazine. He is also a co-founder of The Great Schlep from back in 2008, and is just a really extraordinary thinker, American futurist, and someone who's been very deeply influential in my own thinking. I'm very grateful that he agreed to join us today, and to share some thoughts with us in this liminal time in between how things were 4 weeks ago, before we all moved into a remote scenario, and how things will be like when we emerge from this. So with that, Ari, I will pass it to you to share your wisdom with us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I know we are all in just an uncomfortable situation in the fact that we are home, and hopefully we're with our loved ones, surrounded by our loved ones, or with partners or with friends. And this is not an ideal situation, and I know that, but I'm thankful for Groundswell for providing an opportunity to engage with you guys. What I'm going to do today, and the title of the webinar really is How to Think Like a Futurist in Uncertain Times. And you're going to see some kind of flips of that title as we move throughout it. And so what I'm going to do, just to kind of lay out, is I'm going to present for a little while, then you'll see there's some little micro exercises that you'll do throughout, and then we're going to do some Q&A after that. And so with that, I am just going to get going and go straight into presenting with you all. So here's the thing. I mean, I said early on I was going to kind of, flip the script a little bit on the title. This idea, that these black swan events, that we're in this kind of moment where we are totally shocked and surprised by what is happening, and this is, no one saw this coming. Here's the thing: the surprise-free future isn't. It's a quote, one of many quotes that you'll see throughout that I kind of live by, and that's the reality. This notion that we move through this specific timeline that will never change, and that there are no surprises is just false, right? There are inevitable surprises, and we'll get to that later, how you kind of spot and see those. But I want to first and foremost just start there, because we really are talking, when we talk about uncertain times, even though things feel like they've been moving along steadily for several years, if not several decades, when you actually look back historically, you see we've actually had many events. Obviously, this is probably the biggest one in many ways since World War II, if not the 1918 Spanish flu. But in and of itself, this idea that there are surprises that come out of nowhere, more often than not, is actually false. And so the way we kind of think about this are two things. Obviously, the image, one of those images is Pearl Harbor, right? Quote unquote, no one saw this coming. But the historical record shows that there were folks that were raising flags about this. They just weren't listened to because people were stuck on this idea that what happened yesterday is going to happen today, is going to happen tomorrow. We'll get to that in a second. The other one is an image that may, or an individual that may not be as familiar to many of you, which is Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller was many things. One of the things he was actually the teacher of my mother. And he was in many ways kind of one of the original systems thinker. And he had this quote: "We are called to be the architects of the future, not its victims." And in many ways, this has shaped how I think about the work that I do as a quote unquote futurist, which, as you'll see, is not even necessarily the best title, because it in some way kind of isolates to specific individuals the ability to do what we're all going to go through today. But it also, what this quote actually what it really gets at is this idea that the story is not yet written, even though we like to kind of, we take some comfort in that, and I'll get to that in a second, why we get comfort in that. That's not necessarily the case. And so this is, so Buckminster Fuller passed away, and he had a saying that he said, "Call me Trim Tab." And it was such an important saying to him that it's, as you can see, it's actually on his tombstone. And so I want to talk about what a trim tab is for a second. So he was asked during World War II and afterwards to help the US Navy with a very big problem they had, which was they had to move a lot of cargo across the oceans, but they couldn't figure out how to get the rudder to work on these massive ships, because it turned out that there was kind of like an exponential growth involved. So the bigger your ship was, the larger the rudder you needed and the larger mechanics you needed to turn that rudder. And what Bucky came up with in many ways to attaching to the rudder was this idea of a trim tab. So a trim tab, you may have a 4-foot rudder, but at the very end, you actually only have something very, very small, which is maybe about a 1 or 2 inch almost a rudder at the end of your rudder. And that's called a trim tab. And those of you who are pilots also know these are on airplanes. And the way a trim tab works is it takes very, very little energy to move that 3 to 4 inch piece of metal at the end of the rudder. But what you do is when you do that, it creates kind of negative pressure behind it. And the trim tab itself is what then pushes the larger rudder. So it allows you to move these massively large cargo ships with only a 4 inch piece of metal at the very end. And the reason that's important, and the reason why he said, "Call me trim tab," is he saw that the actions that he took, even though they may seem small in the moment, that when you elongate them over time, actually have massive dramatic effect. And so a massive dramatic effect on the future. And so this is, there's this idea that the future has been exponentially growing, and it's this thing that is far out there, and it's always been on the minds of humans. The reality is the future, as you'll see even from this Google Books Ngram Viewer, which I know, which is not a perfect data set, but this idea of the future only really comes about in the past 200 years. Because up until really the Industrial Revolution and the Technological Revolution, the past, present, and future for most people was basically the same. Whatever you were born into, whatever farm tools your parents used were the ones that you used, and were probably going to be the ones that your children used. And this went really back, 3, 4, 5 generations as much as people knew. So this idea of tomorrow, of the far tomorrow, is a relatively new concept. And we'll get to kind of who owns that concept and how that kind of can drive us in certain directions and not. I want to use a quick example, which some of you on this webinar may not even be familiar with, but this was Radio Shack, right? So when I grew up in a decade not too recent, this is where you went to get a lot of your electronics, before Best Buy, before Amazon. And so what you see on your screen right now is a flyer, or really, actually I shouldn't say a flyer, an advertisement in the late 80s for Radio Shack. And you can see on their phone, tape recorder, music, camera, speakers, a whole bunch of calculator, all these things. And you went to Radio Shack to buy all of this. And within, actually, I should say this is actually the late 80s, early 90s. Within about 12 to 13 years of this entire kind of catalog of this store, we had the iPhone, which actually did everything that you saw in that advertisement. And so one of the things that the future does is it kind of amalgamates what came before, brings it together into kind of a more cohesive package and moves forward. Another great example is Kodak. And this is an example of folks, and I'm using this to kind of tease out what we're going to get to in a second, of folks that didn't necessarily want to seize the future and thought that tomorrow would be a lot like today. And this is Kodak. And so what many people don't know is Kodak actually held the original patents for digital photography. But when the head of R&D went to the CEO of Kodak and said, hey, there's this thing, there's a way of actually taking photos, and instead of putting it onto film, we actually can put it onto a screen and people can see it on their computers. And the CEO of Kodak said, look, that's great, but our business model actually isn't photos. Our business model, where we make money, is not in photography. Where we make money is in the chemicals and selling the chemicals that are used to process photos. And we know where that story went. Kodak is gone and digital photography basically took off. Same thing with Macy's. And this is prior to even the past month. In the mid-90s, a little known individual came to the CEO of Macy's and said, hey, I have this idea. I think we can sell things on TV, clothing and products, and people want to shop from their comfort of their home. And Macy's said, that's never going to happen. People want to get up. They want to go to the stores. And so the person who brought that idea went on to start QVC, and that is now a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and Macy's is basically no longer with us. Now, those are kind of interesting retail versions from the past about what happens when you don't think about tomorrow as something different from today, and you don't think about kind of shaping it. Obviously, with climate change and other issues, we see what happens when you think that tomorrow will be like yesterday and today, and this can lead to a lot of deleterious things. So for many years, I worked with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UN Refugee Organization, helping them think about not just where things are in terms of global refugees, but how this will play out in terms of climate change. And a lot of times what people will do is they'll also do kind of and the idea behind that and the issues at the UN Refugees was there wasn't as much of an inclination to think about what would be happening because the emergency in front was so big. What you see in the middle of the slide is Governor Pete Wilson signing a crime bill, 3 strikes and you're out. Again, not thinking about long-term second, third order consequences. And the other is just obviously, I mean, it's quaint now, this image, and I was trying to think about how to replace it, but I thought I'd leave it in because sooner than not, we will be back to this, I believe. And this is long commutes, right? So we build these houses in these suburbs, exurbs, without actually thinking about, again, the second, third order effects of what will happen. And the other kind of reason that when we think about tomorrow and how we want to be an active agent in shaping that and how to think like a futurist, we more often than not just think about technology. And in a second, I'm going to get to kind of how that ends up becoming more of a problem than it's not. The reason I have this slide up is I want to remind folks that although we're on Zoom right now and there's a lot of technology involved in us having this webinar, the fact of the matter is while our culture, while our software has upgraded and upgrades every several years in many ways through either religion or business model processes, the fact of the matter is the underlying hardware, what makes us us, hasn't fundamentally changed that much in 50 to 80,000 years. We could quibble on a 10,000 years here or there. And the reason I bring this up, and you'll see it in a second, is the things that block us from being better futurists, especially in uncertain times. Yes, part of it is the technical skills, but a major part of it, and we can get to this more in the Q&A, is that we stop and we stop at the water's edge and don't tend to push into what are the kind of mental and cognitive biases that we have as Homo sapiens. And so we're often asked to kind of plan out the future and predict the future. And what I want to, one of the kind of hopefully main takeaways from today is that anyone who thinks they can purely predict the future, you should listen, but recognize that it's, in some ways it ends up being a fool's errand, because there are so many mitigating variables and factors that go into it, that thinking like a futurist doesn't mean you're predicting, it means you're actually shaping. So what we're going to cover today is a little bit of the moment, which we did, Longpath, which is the I run the organization longpath.org, and also how to kind of use Longpath. Again, so I raised this point kind of earlier, which is this predict versus shape the future. I really want you to take away, one of the things I want you to take away from this is, if anyone's telling you they can predict the future, more often than not, they're going to take you down a certain path that can get folks into trouble. So here's a quick example is from Shell. So what Shell used to be a very kind of one of the smaller oil companies, to be honest. And what they did is, as you guys, a lot of you will know this term, they really cultivated this idea of scenario thinking and scenario planning, which wasn't to come up with stories about best case or worst case, but to come up with multiple stories about how the world might work and things that could unfold over time. And one of the scenarios that they developed in the late 60s, early 70s was a scenario called oil shock. And if there was a war in the Middle East, that potentially what could happen is there could be an embargo on oil coming out of Middle Eastern countries. Now, most people thought internally that this was just kind of silly. It would never happen. Middle East countries would never put themselves at kind of economic risk like that. But you all know what happened. There was a war and there was an embargo. But what Shell had done in their scenario thinking and thinking about possible tomorrows, they had actually started storing oil in massive, basically holding tanks that not only allowed them to kind of weather the storm, but actually rise up to become a major player in the oil industry. And so there's three hurdles that get in our ways when it comes to future shaping. The first one is expertism. Now, the thing I want you to not take away is that I have a thing with experts. I think I have an issue with experts. Experts, especially right now, are unbelievably important. The issue becomes when experts say they have a tunnel vision on what tomorrow is. So these are the folks from Bell Labs. And again, I'm far from a Luddite. I think what ends up happening though is technology overpowers our visions of what tomorrow could be. And so we end up having folks kind of dictating ideas of tomorrow in a way that limit the scope of how we can think about it. So what experts do is they give us visions of tomorrow about how things will be, and that's all that we focus on. And as you know, right now, what we focus on is kind of the tech and like the gee whiz and what will happen. And this has been something that sometimes it's these kind of grandiose things from the 1920s, and sometimes it's these almost very dystopian visions of tomorrow. And so it ends up becoming kind of future splainers. And again, sometimes when I'm with other quote unquote fellow futurists, they take issue with this. It's not that I have issues with experts talking about tomorrow. It's that when we do it in a very kind of limited scope, and you go to a panel and it says the future of energy or the future of transportation, as if though there's only one future. And that ends up kind of creating problems when experts dictate solely what can happen, and it doesn't allow us to think about different futures. And so this is just a question: where do you see the forces of top-down expertism in your organization, industry, and life? What ends up happening is these questions are not meant to, again, kind of attack one way or another. It's to kind of shine a light on things that keep us from being future shapers and how to think like a futurist. Now, hurdle number two, many of you guys kind of know short-termism. It leads to, let's not do the maintenance on the oil rig, let's do it next quarter. Or let's not spend time with kids, and it ends up to, 1 in 30 kids dropping out every hour in American high schools. And then ultimately what it leads to is, let's not actually plan for what could happen. Let's just take care of the supplies of what we need in the next few days or the next few weeks. And so I ask this question again: where do you see the force of short-termism in your organization, industry, and life? And again, we'll go over these questions hopefully in the webinar, and we'll be able to tease these out. But more often than not, in the folks that I've been working with over 20 years, this tends to be one of the big ones, right, in short-termism. And to be clear, there's a time and a place for short-termism, but when it comes to thinking about tomorrow and the far tomorrows and the impact that you want to have, that can become a major hurdle. Now, if you think about what I raised earlier in terms of kind of human biology, going back 30, 40,000 years, there was and still is a place for short-termism. If you were being chased by a large animal, you don't want to have a strategy for, well, how did that lion get loose? What happened? How do we prevent that from happening? There are acute emergency actions you have to take. But what ends up happening is we end up living our life like that, day in and day out, and not taking the time to do the kind of thinking that we need to be able to do, to plan. And the final one is presentism. And the presentism is really about kind of living and I know a lot of us feel like we're doing this right now, this kind of, Groundhog Day. And what it leads to is kind of living and planning every day as though it's going to be the same. And what it does is we get complacent, and it keeps us from really thinking about how do we shape tomorrow into something different. What we do is we call that, here at Longpath, we call that kind of a sandbag strategy. So this is actually a home not that far off from the Mississippi. It turns out every other year there's flooding in this area. And so what they do is it's cheaper to actually just always put sandbags around this house and deal with the emergency than it is to either move the house or to build dikes or kind of rethink how they do the planning. And it's something that kind of is, look, I do it. Everyone does a sandbag strategy. Sometimes there's just a time and a place to do that. But it happens, if you keep doing it, it actually prevents you from being this kind of future shaper. So where do you see the force of presentism in your own organization, industry, and life? So this, expertism, short-termism, presentism, I'll use a kind of older example. Some of the examples I sometimes use can be too political. And this is really the one of Blockbuster Video. Most people potentially on this webinar don't even know what Blockbuster is. But it turns out in the early 2000s, a CEO of a very small company called Netflix came to Blockbuster and said, look, you guys do great kind of video rentals in stores. We're doing stuff by mail. Eventually, we'll do it online. We would love to kind of partner. We'll handle the mail stuff. You handle the physical stuff, and we'll combine forces. And Reed Hastings was basically laughed out of the room. And as you know, Blockbuster is no longer with us. And as you know, Netflix is basically most of kind of what we're doing right now, day in and day out during this moment in time. So what is Longpath? Longpath, it's a mindset. It's a framework that we'll go into that helps us kind of think about future shaping in uncertain times. And as I've noted, we're almost always in uncertain times. And so it wasn't that we weren't able to do this. We can plan far ahead, right? We do things like the Panama Canal. We do almost eradicate. I mean, polio is almost completely eradicated because we can think ahead. The Transcontinental Railroad was the same. Marshall Plan, another great example of thinking 10, 20 years out. Suffrage, another great example. And so what is Longpath? It's built on three very distinct pillars: futures thinking, transgenerational empathy, and telos-aligned action. I'm going to go into all of those in a second, but Michelle mentioned that we're in this kind of, for some of us, in a holiday moment. And so I thought it would be a good time to, this is a woodcut that's kind of grim, but that's how those paintings are. This is of Passover, the Exodus story. And so what we know about human nature is that we interpret the world not necessarily through data points or bullet points like I had on the last screen, but really through stories. And the reason the Exodus story is one that I'm going to bring up, not only because we're literally in Passover, but because it's the idea to me of the Exodus story is the ultimate future shaping, right? It starts off the story, again, I'm not saying some people see it as the word of God, some people see it as a story. I see it as a story passed down among generations, meant to teach a lesson. The underlying story here is that, the Hebrews, the Jews were in this moment where they didn't see a different tomorrow. When they thought about the future, they thought about it as a singular thing, that tomorrow will be just like today. And as you know, as the story goes on, they start to think as they move Egypt, as they leave the narrow place, which is how you say kind of Meeks Ryan, this idea of the narrow place of Egypt, as they move through the narrow place, they end up wandering the desert, and many times they want to go back to Egypt, where it was much easier, a much more easier life than this wandering where they didn't know what tomorrow would be, and they had to have a connection to future generations. But what actually was able to also pull them through was this idea of this land of milk and honey, a vision of what things could be, right? And not just the land of milk and honey as a distinct place, but almost as a way of thinking about the world consistently being able to be better. And so these three kind of pillars of the Exodus story happen to be, shockingly or not, the three pillars of Longpath: future thinking, transgenerational empathy, and telos-aligned action. And it's not a coincidence that kind of the three pillars of probably one of the most important emancipatory stories in the at least in the Western canon, in the Judeo-Christian Western canon, which I know is limited, but it also appears in different cultures and places over time, is one that we built Longpath off of, because for these stories to last and be passed down as long as they are, it's because not only because they resonate, but because there's something to them. So what I'm going to do quickly is kind of focus in on each one of these. So futures thinking, there's often this idea of today is going to be like tomorrow. It's a singular point. And we've talked a little bit about how that can kind of get in the way. And right now, when we think about tomorrow, we just think about it through a technological lens. It's kind of like the server farm. I looked at a recent study where they asked kind of about 100 Americans, this is about several months ago, what do you think about the future? And when you think about the future, what do you think about? And 9 in 10 Americans, these are Americans, when they're asked about the future, the answer always had to do with technology. But it's important to know, as I've noticed, that technology wasn't always how people thought about tomorrow. Over time, different cultures in different places have had different visions about tomorrow. Some of them, it was the tomorrow circled back in on the past, so it was obviously circular. And then one of the things that we had, and I'm grateful for the Enlightenment, is it gave us this idea that the future wasn't something that was controlled just by some sort of omnipotent power. At that time, obviously, the church, capital T, capital C. And what we got was, this Enlightenment, and it led to us being able to think about tomorrow as something that we could shape through humans' ability to augment and alter the external environment, mostly through technology. Now, I'm going to move forward a couple of hundred years, and what that leads to is this notion that there are always these kind of high priests that tell us what tomorrow will be. And if you really trace it back, at least in terms of the Industrial Revolution in the West, it's always been around technology. Now, again, it's not that I have an issue with technology per se, but the idea of thinking about tomorrow solely through a singular lens, this idea of the singular future, becomes very limiting. And so our answer to that is not to use and think about the word future and how to be a thinker about the future, but it's really about think about futures and see these things as kind of multiple vectors that come off of today and our ability to shape them. And the question often is like, well, how do I do that, right? That sounds great. And what I want to get kind of through on this webinar partly is, when we think about the future through a singular lens, and let's just say technology right now, which is the path that I'm going on, we end up having a very kind of small bore view of what is possible. So you look at this image on your screen, and it's lovely, it's pastoral, but much like thinking about tomorrow through just one trend or one massive megatrend, it becomes very limiting, and you don't see the bigger picture, right? And so I'll give you an example. We worked with a global automobile company who was worried and thinking about the fact that younger folks in multiple countries were no longer driving and buying entry-level vehicles. 15, 16, 17-year-olds weren't buying vehicles. And we were doing this research with them because we were helping them think about how to build an artificial intelligence-based autonomous vehicle unit. But they said, look, before we get that, we have to figure out maybe like maybe before we spend money on that, we have to think about why people don't want our cars anymore. Is it the shape? Is it the model? Like what is it? Is it the branding? And in the research, what we found was the kind of the biggest, if you will, culprit that was keeping their sales down among many when we did kind of these qualitative focus groups, was that their biggest competitor wasn't other car brands. Their biggest competitor was Twitch. So for those of you who know Twitch, you understand why it is what it is. If you don't, so Twitch was purchased by Amazon a couple of years ago, but it's a global streaming website, both on computers and now on television and apps, where you basically can watch other people play video games. That's the core of their model. And it is so popular now that on certain evenings, there are more 14 to 20-year-olds in that age category, which is what this company was trying to talk to, who are watching other players watch Twitch than are watching all the other TV networks combined. And so again, it's not that a singular way of thinking about things, it can be deleterious, is that it doesn't allow you to see all the multiple things that could happen and that you need to consider when thinking about how to be a futurist and how to shape tomorrow. And so at Longpath, what we developed was these series of Longpath megatrends. And these are at longpath.org/megatrends. And we won't spend a lot of time on them because I'm already taking up a lot of time, is the key thing about megatrends is you'll see just down the middle, right, is technology. Yes, great. But there's a whole host of other megatrends that come into play. One of the ones you'll notice, obviously, is climate-based disease spread, which is what we put COVID-19 under. And it's not that you should look at each one of these individual megatrends as the future. It's that you need to be able to put all of these together. And a way of thinking about that is plate tectonics. So as you guys know, there's a lot of these plates that literally cover the surface of the earth. But where things get really interesting is when these plates push up against each other. That's what gives you the Himalayas. That's what gives you the San Andreas Fault and all these interesting features, geological features on our planet, are when these plates come together. It's the same thing with megatrends. It's the same, thinking about multiple megatrends coming together in your sector, in your organization, or in your life is how you start to think futures. Now, transgenerational thinking, or transgenerational really empathy, is a tougher one, and it's obvious because when we think about our own life, we often think about our own life through a very specific lens. And this is, again, more through the Western canon and Judeo-Christian, but that's the context that we're in, but it's actually kind of global in many ways, is that thinking about life from your birth to your death means that when you make decisions, it could be your biological birth or death, but also it means when you're in an organization and you're the CEO or the VP or SVP, you only think about making decisions through the lens of how long you've been in that position until you leave that position. Whereas to have transgenerational empathy, it means to be thinking about how do you make decisions around the future where not only will you not be there for the impact, which is one way of doing it, but also how are you setting up the one who comes after you to have that? This idea of birth and death overlapping. We see this in certain communities. We obviously, those of us who are parents or caregivers, develop this attitude. The question is, how do we do that in organizational and business and civil society life? Futures, transgenerational empathy, which is at the emotional level, allows you to make decisions that can be very uncomfortable because you have to think about who's going to be in this, vice president role after I'm gone for whatever reason, wherever I'm gone. And as humans, it's going back 50,000 years, anything that has to do with our own demise, be it biological or position of power and status, is a very uncomfortable thing for us to think about cognitively, intellectually. But if we can tap into from a place of empathy for those who come after us, we can start developing better decisions about tomorrow. This is just an image of a shrine in Japan. Every 20 years, they take it apart and they reassemble it. It could last for hundreds of years, but the reason they do that is they're building in a ritual, a cultural ritual. So they're thinking about, what do we do for the next generation to make sure the structure is almost and always at its peak of productivity. And you guys know this marshmallow test. Walter Mischel, who was a psychologist at Columbia, brought in, this was a decade or two ago, brought in some 7-year-old, 8-year-olds and said, listen, you can have one marshmallow now, or you can have, if I come back in 10 minutes and that one marshmallow is still there, you get 2 marshmallows. And you all kind of know what happened. When they came back in the room, 85% of them had eaten the first marshmallow. And so the question is, what transgenerational empathy does is it helps us kind of build this muscle to think about, in that sense, become kind of 2 marshmallow thinkers. One of the people that's on our advisory board that we work with, he's over at UCLA, he's developed this interesting thing where he put a bunch of folks into an fMRI machine where you can kind of see brain activity, and he put a bunch of folks into the fMRI, and he asked them something very simple. He goes, I want you to think, and I'm gonna gloss over some of the deep details, but he said, I want you to think about yourself right now, and one part of their brain lit up, like the left side, I'm gonna say. And then he goes, okay, I want you to think about Angelina Jolie or Matt Damon, someone famous that everyone would know. And another part of their brain lit up, because it was someone they kind of knew, but they didn't know. And then he said, I want you to think about yourself 10 years from now. And what happened was the part of the brain that lit up for the celebrity was the same part that lit up for themselves 10 years from now. Their brain didn't see a connection to themselves 10 years from now. And when he pulled them out, he had a control group where nothing was done. And the other group, he did 2 things. He had them look once a day at an image of themselves aged 10 years older. And they would just look at it for like 20 seconds, see what they look like 10 years older. The other thing he had them do was write a letter to their future self that would be delivered 10 years from now. Now, then he put them back into the machine. Now, he didn't wait 10 years to do it. And you know what he found? He found that the folks that had looked at an image of themselves older, that spent time thinking about it, who wrote the letters, were actually, when he put them back in and he asked them, think about yourself right now and think about yourself 10 years from now, there was a much higher degree of overlap in brain activity in terms of people who had those experiments done on them. So by thinking about the future, by writing a letter to yourself, you were able to have a stronger connection to your future self. Now, one of the things that we have up on our website at longpath.org/future me is a very simple exercise, and you can do this once, you can do it daily, it doesn't matter. What it literally is you can write a letter to your future self. It's stored in by working with, there's a company in Boston that handles the back end of this. But what this basically does is it becomes a way of connecting to your future self by actually doing the writing. It's a cognitive exercise, but it actually builds a sense of transgenerationalism at the molecular level, or I should say at the neuron level, in this idea that, neurons that fire together, wire together. So as you build those images, you start to have that stronger connection to your future self. Some of you have heard this example. When we go to dinner with our kids, you always have to make the decision. Do I give them an iPad now, or do I engage them in conversation? One is very simple and short term. The other is building a muscle that may be difficult in the moment, but allows them to kind of see one way of being outside of the quick tech fix. This is another example of someone who does this extremely well, Patek Philippe. You never actually own one. You merely look after it for the next generation. Again, it's this idea of kind of transgenerationalism. So I asked this question: what do you want? What do you want your work to look like? What do you want the world to look like for your descendants 100 years out from now? Most of the time, we don't have this put in front of us. But even I'll push it out 200 years, even 900 years, right? What this does is it starts to kind of cultivate, what does it mean to be a great ancestor? What does it mean to think about the decisions that you're making now as future shaping? Finally, telos-aligned action. It's really this kind of very simple question: as to what end? So Odysseus, when he was on his journey in the Odyssey, was always kind of getting through the trials and tribulations and shaping his actions because he wanted to get back home. And what we know from kind of cognitive neuroscience is that folks will only kind of take action, much like, this metaphor of the frog that will only jump to the next lily pad if they can already have a glimpse of it, if there's a vision of what that's going to look like. Some of the most important kind of speeches and movements in history, I have a dream, these ways of kind of laying out what that will look like is a way of building a future, not only intellectually, cognitively for yourself, but those that you work with. Another example from JPL wanted to recruit the Jet Propulsion Laboratory connected to NASA, wanted to create the next generation, wanted to recruit the next generation of engineers to work for them. So instead of saying, hey, come work on really amazing stuff, we're launching this thing in 2 years, they put on college campuses around the country travel posters to different planets. Now, this probably will not be real for a decade, 2, 30, 40, 50 years. But what they did was they built out a vision of what the future would be like. And they said, come be a part of that. The kind of final example is, many of you guys have this in your kitchen, the Amazon Echo Alexa. So what a lot of folks don't know is the way Amazon works is they kind of, when they have an idea for a product or for a service, they start off by writing the press release for when this will come out 5, 6, 7 years from now. And they use that to kind of create a very deep vision across all product teams, be it engineering, marketing, communications, software, and different ecosystems. So everyone has a strong understanding and an emotional understanding of what this kind of future looks like, that they want, and they backcast from that. That's a very quick kind of overview of how to kind of be a futurist in uncertain times, recognizing that we are constantly in uncertain times, that you can cultivate a mindset that is future thinking, not locked into one specific future, but to think about preferable futures, to cultivate this sense of empathy, of transgenerationalism. As uncomfortable as it is, there are ways to do it. And that finally, you have to think about how you have a deep vision that is not 2-dimensional, but almost 4-dimensional or 5th-dimensional, where the 5th one is emotion, that you communicate to others about where it is you want to go to. These were the Longpath megatrends. What I'd ask you to do is just take a second, just pick 3 of them, and you'll see why in a second. And I'm just going to ask you, this is and we can do this in the Q&A. You can put this in the chat. So this is a USA Today from April 9th, 2030, 10 years from now. So describe a future in which your organization is flourishing. I want to take a second to do that. And describe a future in which the energy sector is flourishing. So these may be one and the same, it may not be. But I want you to kind of think about what that is, and we can go into that in the Q&A, or you can throw it into the chat, or you can do what you want with it. So I just ran very quickly through what we usually do over 6 hours with folks, but I want to thank you guys for doing that and kind of bearing with me as I run through this. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share, and we can go into Q&A, and as Bartise and Michelle want to take us. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ari. This is Bartise again. My video is not all the way working, but I'll figure that out. But yeah, so Ari has put 2 questions up. If everyone wants to just take a second, raise your hand if you'd like to answer one of those questions and to Ari, and we'll have a discussion. And if you have other questions as well, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get you in for a quick Q&A. So I'll just give everyone a minute or 2 to ask their questions, get themselves together, and we'll go from there.
And so again, it's a headline 10 years from now. How do you see the world flourishing? What does that headline look like? And then, and more specifically, kind of, and because this is a kickoff to Energy Futures, what do you want to see the sector looking like, and what could it look like? And again, it's not about being overly Pollyannish. It's about recognizing what these megatrends, how megatrends kind of help kind of become almost guardrails in a certain sense, because megatrends are these things that are more often than not human-made, 10, 20, 30 years in the making, that will have ramifications over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So use those, but you don't have to when you think about kind of the headlines that you'd like to see.
I can, Ari, just to kind of get the conversation going, I can answer with one headline I would love to see,
Yeah.
which is I want, clean energy to be, 100%, uh, available to everyone across the world. I want every city in the world to be 100% renewable. That's the dream that I want, and I think it's possible, and that's probably why I work at Groundswell, and I do believe that every city around the world will get there their own way. But like, I think that's the headline I want to see, is today every city is, the world is 100% renewable. But yeah.
And something you kind of tucked in there that's really, really important is when you have a headline, this idea 10 years out from now, it's not, and you start to kind of backcast, and this is what we do with folks when we sit down with them. There isn't just one way to get there, right? Like, but if you know what this telos is, if you know what your Ithaca is, and recognizing there are different ways to get there, not everyone will always kind of agree on that, but you're aligned on what that deeper vision is, it gets movement happening extremely in a very robust and a very real way. One of the things I see is climate change curve flattened and plants for dinner again. Yeah, there's we'll have another webinar where we talk about sugar and meat and other things, and how different industries can dictate different futures more often than not. But what I will say is, though, that if you step back and look at organizations or political movements or parties that you don't necessarily agree with, and you're kind of surprised they're doing so well, if you take them apart and try to tease out why they were successful, more often than not, the ones, and it doesn't have to be ones that you don't, by the way, it could be ones you agree with, the ones that provide very powerful, compelling visions of the future are the ones that more often than not win out in the long run. And by the way, that vision of the future can also be retrograde. It can say, we want to go back to something. But if you have a very strong, compelling future, that is probably one of the strongest ways to align action and thinking among individuals. And we see this in sports psychology, like no quarterback ever does visualizations of them losing the game, right? And we see that within organizations, and we see that within movements and within countries.
Looks like we're getting a few more headlines. We've got a question from Michelle Jackson, Ari. So in order to avoid the blockbuster bust, what should leaders be doing?
Well, look, I mean, this is highly self-referential, but Longpath, adopting the Longpath mindset, consistently kind of questioning this idea of what is the probable future. And there's, I should mention, in the futurist world, there's kind of two competing ways of doing that. One is to consistently, and this is the risk mitigation, which you see a lot in government, which is, what are the things that could go wrong, and how do we kind of avoid that or plan around that risk mitigation of these different features? But what I would argue is you need to have a preferred future, and you need to have a very honest conversation about what business as a leader you're actually in. So Blockbuster saw themselves in the business of providing video sets, VHS tapes, to people in the most convenient way possible. We see this in some of their business strategy documents. Reed Hastings at Netflix saw himself in Netflix in the business of providing entertainment and content to people in their homes, regardless of platform. And so I think one of the key ways to kind of avoid this blockbuster bust is to be very honest about, what are you actually in? Are you providing entertainment or some physical form factor? What are you specifically wed to versus what is it that people actually see you as? That's the first order of how to think about it.
Cool. We have a question from Miriam Kelly. I'm going to allow her to talk. And Miriam, you are unmuted, I believe. So if you can go ahead, and ask your question.
Still on mute on my end.
Yeah. Oh, uh-oh. Okay, maybe that was a mistake. Oh well. Sorry. I guess that was a mistake. Miriam, if you do have a question you want to ask, feel free to throw it in the chat. Great. Yeah, it looks like we have another few great headlines. This is really great. But yeah, everyone, if you have any more questions, feel free to tap that hand raise button in the next minute or so. And if not, we'll close it out and give y'all a couple minutes back. So I'll wait a couple more minutes just to see.
And by the way, I having hosted webinars and been on a few of them, you can always obviously tweet me a question. It's very simple. REW is my Twitter handle, or if you want to email, it's ari@longpath.org. Very simple. Happy to follow up. One of the things I'm noticing is the idea of kind of both resilience and independence, and then thinking about what that means in terms of where we are both kind of psychologically and behaviorally right now in this moment. And so even though at Longpath we tend to think about and talk about the next 10, 20, 30 years, there is the next, let's say 10 to 20 months. And what all of our research has shown is that when we're in this moment, what we at Longpath called intertidal, or some people say liminal or interregnum, is that people are the most open for new ideas in these moments, which is, there's pros and cons to that, obviously. But if you're thinking about your headline, one of the things I want you to do is then to think about, for that to happen, both what's in the way, okay, let's do that, but then also what would be the next thing that you would have to do to start moving it towards that. Obviously, I'm biased. I think Groundswell is doing a lot of that in the energy sector, but then this is the time to actually implement something that may have seemed impossible even a month ago. You can start doing that, but it doesn't have to be huge and grandiose, right? It can be this kind of Buckminster Fuller trim tab. It can be a very small thing that plants seeds for new kind of ways of thinking and behaviors. So one of the questions is, how do leaders share this new way of thinking with our whole organization? So I've sent them the TED Talk. That's one. We're developing a kind of PDF curriculum so that this can be sent out at scale. So if you're interested in that, reach back out to me. And emergency, look, the fact is, this goes back to something I said around short-termism. We're in an emergency response mode. So the idea for a lot of folks, the idea of bringing something totally new to bear, like Longpath thinking, isn't always possible. The one thing though that I would push though is to bring to the surface this idea that even in this moment, very tiny things can have these kind of trim tab impacts. And so, it's about thinking about, so when people come to futurists, some of it's about predicting, but I think the folks that I look to in the space that do really interesting work are thinking second and third order effects, right? So I was in a conversation with someone the other day, and this is who's in kind of public health in the area that I live right out here, just outside of New York, and we were talking about with the stay-at-home orders, that leads to less people driving. Less people driving leads to less car accidents and less people hitting deer, which leads to increased deer populations, which will lead to, about 12 months from now, a potential massive uptick in Lyme disease, right? And in deer ticks. That sounds like a negative third, fourth order impact, but what that does is it gets us thinking about, and specifically what I was saying to this individual is, and this may be literally, no pun intended, too in the weeds, but there are certain plants that harbor deer ticks more than others. They have to be even more aggressive in taking those out this summer because of what we're going to see with the deer population and the tick population 12 months from now. So it's a small thing, like we want to prevent a major rise in Lyme disease in the next 12 to 18 months. What do we tell the ground staff at schools that they need to focus on in the next 3 months that will help prevent that from happening in the long run? So for everyone's kind of organization, and even people in the emergency response phase, we can actually figure out what those are.
Awesome. And there's one more question that I saw come in from Michelle, actually. And Ari, can you speak to the power of small action with the sense, I'm not sure if you see this one. Do you see it right here?
Yeah, I mean, this is, what's the power of small, look, the future is not made by, yes, in Hollywood, it's always these grandiose actions, things that happen where we deflect the asteroid. In this kind of COVID-19 moment, do you want a very small, it may not be germane to everyone, so I apologize, but, and it almost sounds silly, it's, those of us with kids, it's about not bringing the phone to the table and spending more time with them, because everything that we know about acute and systemic PTSD, and this is again an example, is that we can get in front of these by being emotionally available and there for the folks that are going through it in the moment. And so this could be, by the way, not just with those and their kids, but also with you and yourself. Putting your phone down in this moment and not kind of death scrolling through everything is one way of taking a very small action that is transgenerational for yourself, even for, it could be 6 years from now, it could be 6 days, it could be 6 hours from now. So thinking about these kind of, what are the ramifications of these very small things that I'm doing? That's obviously on the negative side. On the positive side, what are the things that you can be doing right now that are small and micro to take care of yourself and your community and your organization that adds up to something much bigger down the road? These are these kind of trim tab actions. And what we have found is, more often than not, even literally just talking about this and putting the idea out there can lead to people in their, and I'm sure hopefully this will happen as you go on with the rest of your day, you'll think about these small things that you can stop doing or start doing that aren't necessarily huge lifts, but are literally planting seeds for these futures that you want in your life, in your organization, and in the world.
Awesome. Well, y'all, I think I'm going to close it off there. We're at 1 o'clock at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Ari, for taking the time to do this with us today. And I want to thank everyone for showing up. We had a whole lot of people tap in. So thanks for making it. We're going to have another one in a couple weeks. So go to our website for more there. Click the webinars tab for any updates. And this has been recorded. So if you want to watch it again, come back to the Groundswell website and you'll be able to watch it all there and share it with your friends and family if you'd like to. Ari, would you like to say anything else as a goodbye?
No, I threw the Twitter handle on there if you have more questions, or you can DM me. Those are open. And I just want to thank Groundswell for putting together something like this, which is so necessary. There's a lot of stuff out there, but I think for what you guys are doing and what's needed right now, this is unbelievably important. I'm honored just to be helping you guys kick this off.
Same. Well, all right, y'all. Talk to you soon, and everyone have a good week and good weekend. All right.
Hey, guys.
See ya.